Thank you for joining me for this video, and we'll be talking about the doctrine of Christ. This is a phrase that a lot of people run into around 2 John 9, and it has caused some questions. We're going to be looking at this point. Now, a good point to start at will be to look at the word doctrine itself. What does the word doctrine mean? We can think of the word doctrine as teaching or instruction, but not just any kind of teaching. It is teaching that starts you from a certain point and then you continue to grow in that teaching. You can think of it as the example of when you raise a child. We start teaching the child at a certain point, and as he grows, we continue to teach him more things so that he'll be a complete person, an adult, who can be capable of doing things in the world. So we can think of the word doctrine as teaching or instruction. Now, the word doctrine is used a number of times in the Bible. You can even find it in the Old Testament. Let us look at a few verses here. You can look at Deuteronomy 32:2, Proverbs 4:2, and Jeremiah 10:8 in the Old Testament. There are a lot more verses than that, but those are the ones which we'll look at for this moment. You can look at those at your own time. We will not necessarily go into reading them now. In the New Testament, we have Matthew 7:28, 2 John 9, and also Mark 1:22. I think it's good to take good note of Mark 1:22, so we're going to read it at this moment. And they were astonished at his doctrine, for he taught them as one that had authority and not as the scribes. Now I want us to note that it goes from talking to doctrine and describing what he was doing as teaching. So in each of those verses that we've just mentioned, where we find the word doctrine, we can plug in the word teaching, and it will still make that proper sense as it is saying. Now, the question now might be, what is the teaching of Christ? Now, one thing we need to understand is what Christ taught, he also gave to the apostles to teach. In fact, when we come to the book of Acts, around chapter 1, he tells the apostles that they will be his witnesses to the world. He mentions Samaria, Judea, and all Jerusalem, and that they will be his witnesses in all these places. And what is it that they were witnessing? They were witnessing the things which he did when he was alive. If we look at the book of 1 John, chapter 1, verses 1 through 3, we'll see that John introduces that chapter by saying that the things which they had seen, the things which they had touched, and the things which they had heard. When he comes to verse 3, he says that those are the things that they have declared unto those people that John was writing that particular epistle to, or letter. So they were declaring or being witness of the things which Jesus did in his life. In other words, they were teaching about Jesus. So they were teaching these things which Jesus had given them. So in a sense, we can also still say that Jesus was teaching these things because all of this was coming from him. It was given to the apostles to go and witness about Jesus. Now then, let us look at some examples of where we find the apostles doing this. In the very next chapter of the book of Acts, chapter 2, verses 16 through 41, the first sermon recorded in the Bible, in the New Testament at least, or let me not put it that way because Jesus taught some sermons as well. But this is the first sermon after the ascension of Jesus. And this is where we see Peter talking to a good number of men who were in the city of Jerusalem at that time. So he started by talking about Jesus Christ. In his sermon, he was talking about the things which Jesus did in his life. And these things were what convicted or converted the men who were listening to him. So we can see that the doctrine of Christ or the teaching of Christ involves learning about Jesus Christ, his life, his death, his burial, and his resurrection, and what all of that meant to mankind today. If we go as well following Peter, we can find him also in chapter 4 of the same book of Acts. He's speaking to the council there, and he still talks about those things which Jesus did. And if we follow him again, we go to the 10th chapter of the book of Acts, verses 34 through 43. This is where he's preaching to Cornelius and his household. And you will find that even there, he's preaching those things about Jesus. Now, not only was it done by Peter, we find that Philip did it as well in the book of Acts still. Chapter 8, we find Philip in Samaria, verse 5, and he preached to them Jesus. And then if we move to verse 35, where we find Philip with the Ethiopian eunuch, he preached to him Christ as well. So we see that wherever this teaching is, there is always a teaching about Jesus. And then if we look also in Acts 16, we find Paul and Silas, verses 31 through 32. They also preached these things to the Philippian jailer. Now, going from these things, we see that at these points, they are preaching these things to people who were not yet Christians. But what about people who are Christians? They also still get the doctrine of Christ. If we observe Acts 2, verse 42, the disciples continued steadfastly in those things which were taught by the apostles. So they were still learning of that doctrine. So we can say that the doctrine of Christ has a point where it starts, where it talks about the life of Christ, and then it continues on to the teachings which we need to live by in our lives. And this, Jesus made a point of this. If we observe John 8:31, where he says, "If you continue in my teaching, then are ye my disciples indeed." So first we learn about him, and then we continue in those things which he taught. And remember that he gave the apostles to be his witnesses. So what they were teaching were things that were given by him. And this, in fact, we can see if we look in the book of John 16, verses 13 through 15. When Jesus said he would leave and send the Holy Spirit to the disciples, and that he would lead them into all truth. He will reveal to them the things that he had not yet revealed, but all that he would be giving would be things which were from God, which were from Jesus. And Jesus was also teaching things which were from God. So all that we have in the Bible is the teaching which is from God. And since Jesus came teaching the teaching which was from God, we can also say this is his teaching. Now, one other point which I wanted to add to this, Jesus made an emphasis of love. He says that there should be a love for God. If we observe Matthew 22, verses 37 through 40, he was asked by a lawyer, what is the greatest commandment? And he said to love God, but he also added to that to love your neighbor. But he said the greatest of those was to love God. If we observe also Matthew 15:8, which gives the prophecy of Isaiah, when he said that these people come to me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. So it is important to have a love for God, but not only a love for God, but also a love for your fellow man or your fellow Christian, more especially. Because if you have a love for God, a love and respect for God, you will do what God says to do. John 14:15. But if you also have that love for your brethren, just like Jesus had love for us, then we will not want to see any harm or any bad thing come to him. So maybe to make a final point about this, if we have that kind of love and respect toward God and also to our fellow men, we will have no problem following the teachings of Jesus Christ. And these things will also be seen by others, that will influence others. As we see in Acts chapter 5, the apostles, not the apostles, the church was influencing the world because of the things that were happening. The people were able to see the things that they do, and they respected that, and it influenced them. So the doctrine of Christ, in conclusion, is the gospel, as we would call it, or the life of Christ, and then to continue in the teaching of Jesus Christ. I hope these things will be of a help to you, and you'll be able to use them. Thank you.